We're here in Philadelphia at the annual meetings of the ASC, and it's November 17th, 2017. As a bit of a prelude and some of the background, we'd like to get some things on the record to illustrate to you the importance and the bona fides and the credentials that David Greenberg brings to this interview, as well as to the field in general. He studied physics throughout his academic career, his formal academic training, I should say, earning a BS, an MS, and a PhD, all from the University of Chicago. The PhD conferred in 1969. He lists his areas of specialization within physics, theoretical high-energy physics, in a dissertation topic that pertains to current algebra and phenomenological models of the decay amplitudes of K and eta mesons. Hopefully I got that right. Throughout his career, he's held a number of professional posts. He's worked his way from assistant to associate to full professor, all at New York University. Started there in 1978, and you've been there ever since.
No, 73.
73. Oh, perfect. You've also been an affiliate faculty at NYU's Institute for Law and Society from 1995 to the present day. He's a member also of NYU's Center for the Research on Crime and Justice, and an affiliate for NYU Center for the Advanced Social Science Research. Prior to NYU, he had a life as a research physicist, first at Carnegie Mellon from 1968 to 1970. More within the vein of conventional criminology, he's held the post as a senior fellow for the Committee for the Study of Incarceration. I've got a little note here. What organization sponsored that, or under the auspices of what group?
That was created when the former Senator Goodell, liberal Republican from New York, a species that doesn't really exist anymore, lost his re-election bid for the Senate, and his friends in the foundation world set him up with a big grant to do a policy analysis of incarceration. He knew nothing about the subject, nor did his legislative director, Andrew von Hirsch, who became head of that project. So a committee was assembled. I was a staff person, had already been doing some writing on incarceration, and was hired as the senior fellow to do the research for the group.
Perfect. So the date on that was October 1971 to June 1973. He also had an appointment as an academic visitor at the London School of Economics from 1986 to 87. Over the course of the years, he's earned a number of awards and honors. In 1983, he earned the Outstanding Scholarship Award of the Criminology section of the ASA. And was that for a particular contribution, a scholarly?
In general.
A body of work. Perfect. You were also elected fellow by this organization, the American Society of Criminology, in 1994, also an acknowledgement of the totality of his work to that point, and of course beyond. Over the course of his career, he's edited and authored 8 books, a couple of the notables here. The first foray was back in 1971, Struggle for Justice, that you wrote, that you began writing, I believe, after you had earned your physics PhD. Mathematical Criminology in 1979, Crime and Capitalism, Essays in Marxist Criminology, an edited volume, came out in 1981. And another one that I want to emphasize, especially within the confines of this particular exercise, Building Contemporary Criminology, Forays and Skirmishes, which has a fantastic introduction to sort of his life and his progression from physics into criminology, came out in 2010. In addition to that, he's authored 89 peer-reviewed publications in criminology and sociology, and you've also done quite a bit of work in gay and lesbian studies and been acknowledged for that within sociology, so we want to also pay deference to that. He lists as his areas of specialization: criminology, deviance and social control, sociology of law, human sexuality, historical sociology, evolutionary psychology, mathematical modeling, and statistical methods in social sciences. Wraps up that comprehensive list. And going back to sort of the introduction that was offered in Building Contemporary Criminology, I'm wondering if you could walk us through the progression of how one makes his way from the University of Chicago in physics, in theoretical physics, into criminology and the criminological orbit?
It was completely unplanned, though you can see antecedents in my earlier life that helped to make it possible. My intention in college and in graduate school was to be a socially informed physical scientist doing work in high energy physics. And while I was in graduate school, I co-authored a book with a fellow graduate student in physics, still in print, and and some journal articles. So I went off to Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh when I finished my PhD, and continued to publish journal articles in physics while maintaining an independent life as an activist, and that's something we should talk about a little bit later. But when my postdoc came to an end, I could not find a job in physics. Partly this was an issue of the job market in physics collapsing. Most of my graduate school cohort could not get physics jobs in the United States. Some were able to go abroad and get jobs in Europe or in Latin America. Many switched to other fields closer to physics and math, such as computer science. Those options did not appeal to me. I wanted to stay in the United States because of my political activism, and so I started applying for jobs elsewhere. And those efforts were initially unsuccessful, but with the help of the radical historian Stoughton Lind, I was able to get a job teaching half-time as an adjunct in a small college in Chicago, Columbia College. My half-time appointment meant 4 courses a semester, and the pay was $500 per course. Fortunately, I have an abstemious Spartan lifestyle. For political reasons, that job came to an end after the 1 year of teaching. But while I was doing that job, and now I can't think of how I could possibly have done it, I was writing the first draft of the book Struggle for Justice. I had, when in graduate school, written a pamphlet on prison conditions, and the reason was I was affiliated with a draft resistance group. We'll talk more about that in a bit. But I was expecting to go to prison for draft refusal during the Vietnam War, and started reading sociological studies of inmate subculture, prison socialization, prisonization process, and wrote a pamphlet calling for the abolition of prisons. It was initially published on just with a small run of a small printing press that the group owned. AFSC picked it up, got some nice photographs to illustrate it, and circulated it nationally. While I was at CMU, the AFSC decided to constitute a working party on prisons. Quakers had been going to prison since the 17th century in England for religious heterodoxy. In the United States, they sometimes went to prison as conscientious objectors during the First and Second World War. And after that, the AFSC might open a halfway house every 5 years as their way of doing something charitable for prisoners. But with more Quakers going to prison during the Vietnam War, they felt called upon to do something further. And we were asked to help them think about what they might do instead. They constituted a group of about a dozen people. Many of them were chosen because they represented different Quaker constituencies and didn't really contribute very much to the project. There were 3 important people in the project who had done some thinking about prison issues. One was Caleb Foote. He was a Quaker who had gone to prison during the Second World War for draft refusal, and then became a professor of criminal law, first at Penn and then at Berkeley. The second was John Irwin, an ex-convict criminologist. He had gone to prison twice as a young man for armed robbery, decided he was a failure as a thief. When he got out, he went to college at UC Santa Barbara and then on to Berkeley sociology for his PhD. So he and Caleb and I discovered that we had developed similar ideas about some of the issues in the criminal justice system, such as the role of discretion and its potential for lending itself to racial discrimination. We thought the treatment model that seemed to dominate liberal thinking had downsides to it, and some of those ideas went into the book. We circulated drafts among one another, and then I was constituted to write the first draft of that. When I lost my job at Columbia College, that Struggle for Justice book had not come out yet, but word about it was circulating. I was at home one day in November wondering what was going to become of me, and the phone rang. It was Andrew von Hirsch. I had never heard of him, but he told me that they had gotten this big grant. They needed to hire a staff person on short notice. It was in November. Academics were in the middle of their fall semester. He wondered if I knew of anyone who was available. I said, yes, myself. He flew out to Chicago, interviewed me, brought me to Washington, D.C., where the Committee for the Study of Incarceration had rented office space from the Lawyers' Committee on Civil Rights Under Law. I worked with him for a week, and then he hired me.
I find it a nice historical oddity, knowing your politics and von Hirsch's, right? It seems to be a contrast, and I'm wondering...
He considered himself then, and may still consider himself now, a kind of social democrat. You know, people think deterrence, justice model, they associate that with right-wing politics. He was not at all a right-wing person. He was quite liberal politically.
Okay. And so you began there's a part in the story there, just recently having read over your reflection, that contribution. You talked about you had to downplay the physics PhD and all those publications. You're probably one of the only criminologists who's published in Physical Review. Have a book. You had a book to your credit, and you just completely dismissed that because I suppose it raised a red flag.
Well, you know, when the Committee for the Study of Incarceration had been going well into its second year, I saw that the grant money was going to run out, so I started applying for academic jobs and initially hid my physics background altogether. I just put PhD, University of Chicago, 1969, and by then I had a law review article dealing with imprisonment and a few other memos that I had written for the committee. So I got a phone call from the chair of the NYU Sociology Department where I'd applied, saying, we assume that your PhD was in sociology, but we were curious as to why there were no references from the University of Chicago Sociology Department. I then explained to him over the phone that I have never taken a sociology course in my life, except for the 2/4 of a required core course requirement in the social sciences. And he said, I think I'd better go back to my committee to see whether we should bring you in. And I said, well, of course, go ahead, but let me tell you, I'm going to be in New York anyway. It won't cost you anything to interview me. So he called back, and they did interview me. I gave a talk and interviewed faculty, and then a job offer came. In the interim, I had gotten another phone call from Cal State Los Angeles. The head of the department said they had a big debate over whether to invite me for a talk. They just decided to interview me on the East Coast. The head of the department was going to be there. They offered me a 1-year visiting appointment. That was not very appealing, but I was still waiting to hear from NYU, so I was unsure what to do. The head of the department came from Germany. He was not Jewish. I decided to exploit German guilt. So I said, Passover is about to begin. I'm religious, which is not true, but I cannot use the telephone during the holiday. Could you give me an extra week to let you know? He said, oh, of course. And then NYU came through with the offer, so I turned down Cal State Los Angeles.
Now, there was also a last-ditch effort to get you into a social science PhD program that ultimately fell through as well.
Yeah. When my time in the postdoc was coming to an end, I had become friendly with Leonard Rapping, who was an assistant professor in the economics department. In fact, he and I and two historians team taught a course that last semester called Radical Social, Political, and Economic Thought. And just as a little footnote, one of the undergraduates in that course was Daniel Nagin, who later told me that taking that course was very influential in his choice to pursue an academic career instead of going into finance, which is what he thought he might do initially. Well, I was teaching Leonard Marxian economics. He was teaching me Keynesian economics. He himself had been a graduate student of Milton Friedman at the University of Chicago and was somewhat conservative politically, but because of the war had become more left thinking.
Well, Milton's famous for making arguments for a non-coercive draft, and David,
Yeah,
I believe, he would have been within your cohort.
Yes, David Friedman and I knew each other. He was more of even farther than his father in being a kind of right-wing libertarian. But Leonard encouraged me to get a second PhD in economics. I applied to the CMU economics department and got admitted. They agreed to waive all course requirements. All I needed to do would be to take the comp and go on to a PhD. I would be supported on Leonard's grant. A month after that, the university withdrew its admission on the technical grounds that I had applied after the deadline. I had, but they had admitted me, and graduate departments often waive deadlines if there's someone they want to get. The story behind what they told me is that I had written a pamphlet called Who Rules CMU? It was a power structure study. In the aftermath of Domhoff's book, Who Rules America, activists started doing research on local universities, who was on their board of trustees, how did this affect policy in the universities. So I did one for CMU and documented how the Mellon family, through its members of their different boards of directors, Mellon Bank, Alcoa Aluminum, Gulf Oil Company, were heavily dominated the board of directors and made certain policy choices. So this made me persona non grata to the Mellon family. One of the nicer, more amusing activist activities of the students on campus that year was to prepare for the Gulf Oil stockholders meeting. It was going to be held in Pittsburgh. People got proxies from sympathetic church groups and other AFSC, went into the stockholders meeting and made motions saying that Gulf Oil should stop supplying fuel to the Air Force, should stop supplying napalm to the Air Force, and things of this sort. They held a guided tour of the ruling class. They nominated Richard Mellon to be King of Pennsylvania. So the Mellon family wanted me out. They said they would hold up a $2 million donation to the university until I was out. That's what was behind the withdrawal of admission.
So, in the meantime, I guess, how are you picking up Marxist thought, and how are you picking up criminological influences? What were you drawn to in terms of literature, or who is kind of instructing, or where were these influences coming from?
From different directions. I never studied criminology in college. I had some exposure to social thought, but during the Vietnam War, teach-ins were being held. I started reading more broadly, reading Marx, reading Marcuse, reading anti-imperialist literature, and I'm kind of a voracious reader and read quite widely. And the women's movement was coming out with new ways of thinking about gender issues that were important. When I got that job teaching at Columbia College, I was asked to teach a criminology course, and so I quickly, probably at an ASC meeting, went through the literature tables, acquired some readers and textbooks, and started reading them.
Now that was an important transition, if I recall correctly, in that it was a research methods course, correct? Or something along the lines of statistical methodology.
Well,
and you had trained as a theoretical physicist, and so now you're...
I wasn't teaching research methods at Columbia College. That wasn't taught at all. In fact, there was no sociology major. It was a general social science major, largely text-based. After I was at CMU for a few years, I was asked to teach a graduate sequence in statistics. And my initial reaction was, I don't know any statistics. As a physicist, I didn't analyze data. In our Intro to Physics undergraduate course, we had one lab where we had to compute a chi-square, but that was the last time I had done anything with statistics. John Irwin, who helped me make the transition into sociology, was a student of David Matza and Irving Goffman. He considered himself to be a symbolic interactionist, was very skeptical about statistical methods or quantitative methods in general. In fact, he told me statistics was ruining mathematics and blamed James Coleman in particular for damaging sociology by putting it in a quantitative tract. However, the guy who was teaching that course was going on sabbatical. He said, I'll give you a copy of the textbook I use. With your math background, it won't be a problem. It was Blaylock's Social Statistics. I took it home and read it over the weekend. I could see that it wasn't mathematically difficult, but I didn't have a feel for it. It was like a cookbook. Do this, do that, do the next thing. So I went to the library and found a book by Freeman in mathematical statistics and fell in love with the beauty and elegance of the subject. I taught that course the first year. I think I did a very poor job of teaching because it was hard for me to connect to students who had a weak math background. I had a tendency to take too much for granted. But I taught it later on and off over many years and began to find strategies for presenting the material in a more accessible way. In those old days, there were no PCs, and I didn't know anything about mainframe computers either. Everything was done by hand calculation. Later on, I saw computers were becoming more important. In our department, we had a lab where there were terminals. The terminals connected to a mainframe that was in another building. So people could key in their commands without seeing what the results were. It was really quite onerous. You had to, in winter, put your coat on, go out of doors, walk over to another building to get the output. You'd see the run didn't run. You'd have to go back to your office to make the syntax correction, try it again, sometimes doing this multiple times. Eventually, PCs came in, and our department got PCs for all the faculty and a graduate student lab. So I shifted to PCs.
So in the summation of your sort of your vita here, we listed off a handful of different sort of research foci, right? I'm wondering if you could maybe define for us the domains. Are these separate themes that you follow, or are these coherent in your imagination that all revolve around a single issue?
Not been one single issue. There have been a number of different domains, and many of them have come about from external instigation. So to start, while I was doing this stint at the Committee for the Study of Incarceration, one of the issues was, what is the impact of locking people up? So that raised questions of deterrence, questions of incapacitation, rehabilitation, and so forth. So I wrote some memos on that subject for the committee, but continued after I left the committee to make the consequences of social control efforts a theme that continues from time to time to be revisited in my work. One of my first sole-authored publications was on the incapacitative effects of imprisonment that was dealt partly with collective incapacitation. If you take 1 million people out of circulation and lock them up, how much of a reduction in crime follows from that? A second part of that dealt with the use of prediction to do selective incapacitation. That has remained an ongoing interest. How good are the prediction instruments, or often how bad are they? I showed in that paper that the instrument that was being used by the California Adult Authority could improve the accuracy of predictions as to future criminality by about 1%. There were high rates of false positive, people that would be predicted as having reasonable prospects of going back to crime, who, as far as we know, did not do so. That problem of false positives remains an ongoing concern to me. I've had some debates and dialogues with people at the John and Laura Arnold Foundation. They have been developing prediction instruments for use in pretrial decision-making. I've tried to tease out from them what is the false positive rate. They've been very cagey in answering that question. They say, oh, it's not too high, but how high is too high is not clear. About 5 years ago, I was at an ASC meeting where Richard Burke, who's a truly stellar statistician, gave a talk based on work he had been doing with data from the Philadelphia Police Department, trying to predict who in the future might either commit an attempted or actual homicide or be the victim of an attempted and actual homicide. He used very sophisticated methods. He found the false positive ratio to the true positive ratio to be about 10 to 1. And he said the police were fine with that. I raised a question, how about the people themselves who were being wrongly predicted? Have you asked them? They haven't staken this also. He had not done so at that point and thought, 10 to 1 ratio of false to true positives was satisfactory. So I did also then a survey of the effectiveness of different treatment programs, something along the lines of what Martinson did on a longer scale. I knew Martinson, had some friendly dialogues with him. Another person who got denounced for conservative views himself was actually a member of a socialist political organization. He described himself as a right-wing social democrat, the pro-Nixon wing of the Socialist Party.
He's a freedom rider, right?
Yes, actually, he had been imprisoned himself in Parchman Penitentiary in Mississippi for 6 months because of being a freedom rider. So I updated, in a sense, the Martinson report, which was actually Martinson, Wilkes, and Lipton, and came to very similar conclusions. I didn't say nothing works. I said we don't have strong evidence as to what works. And that's important because one of the rationales for indeterminate sentencing was we need lots of time to rehabilitate people. And in the absence that this was working, that rationale seemed to fall by the wayside. And this, I think, helped to contribute to the disillusionment with the treatment model, which was never effectively implemented in American prisons, probably couldn't be implemented very well in the custodial setting, but it became a rationale, I think, by which liberals could assuage their guilty consciences for locking people up by saying it's for their own benefit in the long run. In fact, after Struggle for Justice came out, I did some public speaking to Quaker audiences who found them getting angry at me when I told them, if this is your rationale for locking people up, it's not a good rationale. You cannot do it with the expectation that it's for their good. If you be honest with yourself, it may be for your good, that can be debated, but it can't be for their good. I did, on the same theme, another paper on the statistical methodological problems in deterrence research, and was one of the first to recognize a problem of endogeneity. If you predict crime rates from imprisonment rates imprisonment rates cannot be treated as exogenous to crime rates. And later there was a study that Dan Nagin did with an economist named Fisher, who developed the same theme in a more systematic way. Now, that dilemma of how you deal with endogeneity plagued me. I spent some time trying to think about statistical methods for doing this. Instrumental variable ideas had already been known in econometrics. They're hard to implement with cross-sectional data. The difficulty is choosing a proper instrument. A bad choice leads to results that don't give you what you want, that can be biased. And I had the idea then of how you could resolve this problem with longitudinal data, panel data in particular. Now, I had made the acquaintance of an NYU graduate student who finished just before I arrived, Ronald Kessler, who was very good at statistics. So I sounded him out on my planned strategy for resolving the problem of endogeneity with panel data. He thought it would work. I did not know anything about statistical software at this point in time. I was just learning basic statistics myself. But he said, I know a program that will do the job, Lisrael. That was the first program for doing structural equation modeling with computers. So I got a copy of Lisrael. The two of us worked together on a couple of papers, including one on police force size, and we did a methodological paper. One draft of our paper got circulated to people at Madison, and Philip Hauser and Arthur Goldberger, a sociologist and statistician, were running a graduate methods seminar. So they spent 2 sessions going over our draft paper very closely. We knew this because Ron had a girlfriend who was in that class, and so we learned about this in advance. And then we got a short, curt note from Hauser saying, prove to me that your model is identified. Well, we panicked. We had eyeballed it, and we're pretty sure that it was identified, but we had not sat down to prove it. In fact, it was, but only under circumstances in which the model was not in equilibrium. If a system was in equilibrium, it's found a stable point, and collecting data at subsequent time points doesn't add anything new. We hadn't thought about that. Fortunately, our data were not in equilibrium, but this invitation to address that issue stimulated Ron and I to write another paper that got published in the Methodology journal, the conditions under which simultaneous equation models with panel data are identified. And we then went further to write a book called Linear Panel Analysis that was, at that point in time, a cutting-edge methodology for analyzing linear panel models.
That had an implication for a debate with Al Bloomstein, though, right? In terms of their paper arguing that there's a stabilizing equilibrium in terms of penalty and penalty rates.
I think there was not a debate that I'm aware of. I wrote a critique of something that Al Bloomstein did.
Durkheimian assumption.
Al had done a stimulating and very outstanding paper in many ways with Dan Nagin and Jacqueline Cohen, yes,
Yeah.
who were working with him on an oscillatory model of prison populations. They drew on Durkheim's ideas about social control, but when I read about that, I had questions about. I had always been suspicious of that particular set of ideas about Durkheim, of these equilibrating processes. And I love Durkheim, I teach Durkheim, and I find it very rich in ideas, but I thought it was not descriptive, probably, of American or Canadian prison populations and crime rates. They had shown in their data that the prison populations had oscillated. They hadn't shown that crime rates were oscillatory. And I got some data and reanalyzed it with the notion that the oscillations were being driven by oscillations in the level of employment. And so that seemed to work very well. Now, Blumstein, Cohen, and Nagin had the misfortune to predict this oscillatory equilibrating patterns at the worst possible moment in time, because it was just at that point in the early 70s when American prison populations began a steady rise that persisted over several decades. Whatever, even if you thought there had been equilibrating processes at work in the past, they were clearly no longer operative. And of course, Al has addressed that in subsequent work. And I returned to it some years later, working with then graduate student Valerie West on state differences in growth of imprisonment rates. All of the American states had been growing in their prison populations, but some faster than others. We were able to look at what the state level characteristics were that promoted more rapid prison growth. Race was one of them. States that had more percent black in their population had prison populations that grew faster than others. It wasn't just crime rates that drove it, but crime rates were relevant to that growth. And that was important for critics of mass incarceration to know. You found some writers, well, Kant would have been one, there were others who said, prison population is growing completely independently of crime rates. They're totally unrelated to one another. That argument overlooked a decade in which violent crime rates were rising very steadily. It overlooked the public pressure on politicians to do something about drive-by shootings, to do something about open-air drug dealing, and higher rates of victimizing crime.
So you see these as kind of fitting into sort of separate baskets in a bit of a way. I see some real clear implications in three vital domains. There always seems to be some sort of relationship to sort of a theoretical framework or a theoretical vision that's being evaluated in terms of its validity. And then there seems to be a strict adherence to empirics and methodology that you bring to the table as well. And then a lot of these debates are tied to really important in developing policy questions that need to be answered.
And there's some additional themes that I'll come to in a minute.
Okay.
But certainly quantitative methodology is an ongoing interest. I hope to return to panel data methods. The book that Ron Kessler and I wrote is out of print and badly out of date. It's been an area where there's been major advances in the econometrics of panel data. There are fine books on panel data econometrics. Most of them are inaccessible to the typical sociologist or criminologist. And they don't always tell you how you would estimate these models using commercially available software. So I hope at some point to do a new textbook on panel data methodology. Now, I've also been interested in time series methodology. Early in my career, ARIMA modeling was the most advanced method available. ARIMA stands for Autoregressive Integrated Moving Average Models, was developed by Box, Chow, and other contributors. But in the interim, econometricians developed new methods for time series. I initially paid little attention to them. I knew in a general way that this work was going on. but I started paying more attention to them when David Cantor and Kenneth Land published a paper developing their explanation of why these studies were coming out with conflicting and inconsistent or unclear results. They suggested that unemployment could influence crime rates in two different ways. One was a motivation effect. That's what the materially driven rational choice models would suggest. But they suggested there's a guardianship dimension also, that when people are unemployed, they may stay home more often. Their burglars will be more reluctant to break into a dwelling when someone is present. If people are out on the streets less, they're less at risk of being victimized by interpersonal facial crimes. So I found myself looking more closely at the methods. I didn't not like the empiricist way that Cantor and Land were applying these models. They were making assumptions that seemed to be data fitting, different kinds of models for each offense category. It didn't seem very rigorous to me. And the connection between the models ultimately being estimated and the theory became attenuated. So I then started learning the newer econometrics methods of co-integration models and vector error correction models, reconstructed the data set that Cantor and Land were using and updated it, and then wrote a paper on time series analysis of crime rates that was published in the Journal of Quantitative Criminology. They decided to do a special issue on that topic. So they featured my paper and then had commissioned a bunch of other authors. One of the papers was written by Sean Bushway and Ray Paternoster, and Cantor and Land had a brief response also. Land and I are good personal friends. We continue to debate some of these issues. So I remain interested in methodology themes, and methodology was in part an issue in a more recent controversy, but it stems from a substantive issue initially. When I first started teaching criminology, I needed to say something about the age distribution of crime. The textbooks from the early 70s all commented that crime occurs disproportionately for young people. And this was known as the maturation effect. But giving it a name didn't explain why that maturation effect existed. And I took it as a challenge to ask, what can sociology say about the tendency of crime to decline as people get older? Why, if treatment processes are not doing it, what else in life might be doing it? And I saw this as a challenge for Marxist criminology, which was coming up at that point in time. Marx developed his ideas for studying class processes, not for studying crime particularly, or for age. If I find a theory that seems to have some value in the domain where it was developed, one can then test the limits of that theory by seeing where else can it tell you something, or where does it break down. So I took that as a challenge for understanding aggregate age distribution of crime. And I saw another challenge also, which was the challenge of bringing together global or macro aggregate processes involving the major institutions of society and the people living in those institutions, where a symbolic interactionist analysis might have some purchase. And this led to a paper on the age distribution of crime. At the time, I was really not aware of how important it was to publish in high visibility outlets. I got an offer to publish it in a low visibility journal. I knew I needed to have publications on my vita to get tenure, so I accepted it, and regretted actually later on that I didn't hold it back and try to publish it in a more conspicuous journal.
So then you revisited is that when you revisited it later, and then it fell into the Goffson and Hirschi debate?
Yes.
The AJS piece?
Yes,
Okay.
that's right. So the age distribution of crime has been an ongoing interest, and what happened in the debate with Hirschi and Goffson was they wrote a paper published in the American Journal of Sociology in which they made the claim that no sociological theory could explain the age distribution, from which they inferred that it must be biological by elimination, and highlighted my paper as a failed effort, claiming that the age distribution was the same in all times and places, historically invariant, cross-culturally invariant, and therefore no sociological explanation could hold. I wrote a response pointing to evidence that it was not invariant historically or cross-nationally. There were differences, and I had actually never claimed that my theory would explain all of it, but I did suggest that it had some explanatory power. In any event, AJS published my response, and that kind of has kept me looking for further evidence dealing with these issues. Now, in the last year, Daryl Steffensmeyer published a paper in Criminology on the age distribution in Taiwan, radically different from what we see in Western countries. Crime doesn't drop off until people get fairly old. Now, one of my students, a fellow named Yam, last year got similar data from Korea, which is very similar in shape of the curve to Taiwan. We are hoping to publish some analysis of Korean data. At this meeting, I was speaking to a Russian criminologist who tells me, the peak age for homicide in Russia is about 45. Rates remain high above that point in time. So we're hoping to collect further data on this in a number of different countries.
So I'm wondering if we could maybe step back to the 1980s, because there was also another important debate that occupied the field that you played a critical role in terms of adjudicating. This issue of selective confinement and career criminality is something that your work speaks to in a very...
I'd like to stay on this earlier theme for just one further moment, because it leads to, I think, another lively controversy that has more of a methodology dimension to it, but also some substantive interest. In some ways, the field of studying the age relationship to crime has been transformed in the last quarter century. All of us at that time in the debates were looking at aggregate data. That was necessary because that's all there was. We didn't have much in the way of long-term trend data for individuals. Now we can trace people over several decades. In England, there's the data set that David Farrington has analyzed, the London birth cohort. There have been cohorts in the United States. Now, much of that work has been done using a technique that goes by various names. Most statisticians call it finite mixture modeling. Dan Nagin calls it the group-based trajectory model. That method makes the assumption that there's a discrete finite number of trajectories. It will provide you with the best fitting model, assuming that there are two discrete groups being in your data set, or 3 discrete groups, 4 discrete groups. It will give you a goodness of fit test as to the optimal number of groups. Now, this method assumes that there's a discrete number of groups, usually 3 to 6. It doesn't test for the discreteness of the distribution of heterogeneity across individuals. That's just built into the assumption. Now, I have always been skeptical about this discreteness of the trajectories. Another possibility is that it's a continuum that's being forced into the artificially by the algorithm of the finite mixture model procedure to assume that there are discrete numbers of groups. I encourage Dan, who worked in developing a SAS proc-traj for analyzing this, to build in a test of the assumption. And he was always didn't want to do that, whether he thought it was unimportant or thought that it might have been afraid of what he would find, I'm not clear. In any event, I started reaching out to people who are doing this type of analysis, asking people to give me the data sets they had analyzed in that way so that I could reanalyze them using latent growth modeling, which builds on the assumption that the groups are distinguished continuously rather than discretely. Many wouldn't give up their data sets, didn't want anyone looking over their shoulders at what they had done. But finally, I was able to get a data set from Mike Ezell. He had done for his dissertation at Vanderbilt or maybe, I'm sorry, not at Vanderbilt, maybe it was at Duke, longitudinal data on kids that were released from the Youth Authority in California and followed over several decades. So we had a data set for two different cohorts, something like 4,000 children followed over 30 years' time. And I reanalyzed them, doing separate analyses for Black, Latino, and other. There were too few whites to break out. They were put into the other category. And found no clear evidence for discrete groups. They seemed to be largely continuous, or if there were discrete groups, they were overlapping to such an extent that it wouldn't mean very much to call them discrete groups. Now, Dan was not happy with this, and in fact, at an earlier ASC meeting, when we were in conversation about these issues, he got so angry that he stalked away in the middle of the conversation, which I regretted because I think Nagin is one of the top people in our field. In any event, the paper that I wrote up on this ultimately was published in the Journal of Life Course in Developmental Criminology and was put on an honor list that the Springer maintains for the papers that are most likely to be influential. Their slogan is "Changing the World One Journal Article at a Time." And I think now other life course trajectory researchers have more options at their availability to analyze their data. And I think there's a substantive issue here also. We think differently about offenders if we think they're a discrete species, unlike the rest of us. And here I have to say, Nagin, to his credit, always says in his papers, this is simply a rough approximation to a more complex underlying reality. But my observation is people hear that in the talk, but they walk out of the talk saying, well, here are the life course desistant offenders, and here are the life course persistent offenders, and so forth. They tend to reify and fossilize those categories. And that does have implications for selective incapacitation. It's a lot easier to do this if we think a la Lombroso, that offenders are a subhuman species. There's nothing you can do but keep them locked up for the rest of their lives.
So could you give us a little bit more about sort of the back and forth of that debate, and maybe a little bit of how it kind of panned out, or is this still an issue today? You reference it as still...
I don't think there's an issue. A lot of people have used proc-traj. Dan has gone around the country offering workshops and doing this. There's now a Stata user-created way of doing that analysis. I'm hoping that my paper will sink in and give people more tools to find optimal fits. Now there's another issue here, which is curve fitting can be fun to do, but what are the implications of this theoretically? You can learn that something in someone's background predicts rearrest, let's say, but what does it all mean? Is there a potential bias that you're trying to predict outcomes for individuals and not looking at the institutional settings or the macro circumstances in the society? Globally, in the United States, recidivism rates have fallen for people being released from prison, just as crime has fallen in the country as a whole. There are broader cultural trends or institutional trends that are not looked at if the only issue is which of the individuals we have in hand are going to return to the courts or which not. When I look through the code book for David Farrington's work on the London cohort study, it's heavily oriented by the disciplinary background of the principal investigators, which is psychology. There's virtually nothing about the school or the neighborhood, much less the economy of Great Britain as a whole. So sometimes substantive decisions are being made indirectly, without much thought, by the choice of a method.
I wonder if we could go back to some substantive issues here,
Sure.
because there have been another couple of important debates that you've had on theoretical grounds, with sort of supports that we can bundle them in sort of control theory generally. So there's a back and forth with Travis Hirschi about sort of re-examination of his Richmond use study, and then there's an important exchange and a critique that you offered against Donald Black's The Behavior of Law. Could you talk to us a little bit about the tenor of those debates and the importance?
Well, I start out by saying I consider Travis Hirschi to have been one of the giants in our field. My paper on delinquency and the age structure of society draws on his work on control theory. But in my work, control theory was only part of the picture. I also drew on strain theory and tried to look at the circumstances in the life of juveniles that might create motivations to engage in crime. And I focused particularly on two. One is the school setting. I drew on my own memories of how some of my teachers in high school and in the last years of elementary school would humiliate and embarrass students if they didn't know the answer to a question, as if they were to be blamed for being stupid. And I also looked at the exclusion of juveniles from the labor market. And this is where the Marxian analysis came in. 100 years ago or more, most young people entered into the labor force at a relatively early age. My grandfather escaped in his early teens from an orphanage in Cincinnati, made his way on his own to Chicago, and was self-supporting probably from the age of 13 on. Young girls might enter into a household as a domestic servant. Boys could be an apprentice to a master craftsman, or they could get factory jobs at a fairly early age. They could marry at a fairly early age. Only now is New York abandoning 14 as the age at which marriage could take place. In the United States, for several centuries, the age of consent to sex vacillated between 10 and 12, and it was the same in the UK for 500 years. But as the Industrial Revolution took place, juveniles were pushed out of the paid labor force and pushed into schools to keep them off the streets primarily. So I suggested had to do with the dynamics of capitalism, not being able to supply enough jobs. In periods of depression, there was a desire to save jobs for male heads of households. As their husbands got higher incomes, wives didn't need to work so much anymore. So that was the macro change that was creating the setting in the classroom or in the peer group setting. That was my effort to merge the macro and the micro. Well, macro processes are hard to study, and I would say that there hasn't been a great deal a follow-up to that research. Manuel Eisner has been documenting in many European settings long-term historical decline in violence. He argues that, and I think that there's been a greater cultivation of self-control. I see state control as becoming stronger, and institutions like the school or the military also functioning to socialize people, not necessarily to be more self-controlled, but to be less impulsive, less likely to erupt in violence. The population has mostly become disarmed. In medieval Europe, if you were a commoner or an aristocrat, you might have a knife to cut your meat, you might have a sword at your side or a pistol when guns came in. Part of the extension of state control has been to predominantly disarm much of the population. Now, so coming back to Hirschi, he and I never debated the importance of control apparatus. He makes the stronger argument that once control is taken into account, you don't need anything beyond that. He and Gottfredson made the strong claim that the motivations to commit crime are very widely distributed in the general population. Everyone wants more. At times, everyone is angry enough at another person to want to slug them, and they refrain from doing so only because of the potential costs to them. Now, I did write a critique of that perspective for a paper honoring the late Ruth Kornhauser, who was an acquaintance of Hirschi and another control theorist. Her book, Social Sources of Delinquency, has some trenchant, finely honed critiques of the strain models, but I think both of them went too far. I use the example of child molesting. I will simply take it as an empirical observation that few adults are interested in sexual contact with babies. A small number of them are. And we recognize that they have some desires that are not widely shared. Now, if that's true for one particular kind of crime, isn't it at least plausible that it would be true for other kinds of crime? That there is some differential in the desire to acquire property that cannot be obtained legitimately. And here I point out that for an economist studying supply and demand for different consumer goods or for demand and supply of labor, it would be pretty odd to say that you're allowed to look at the effects that differences of prices have on the demand for a product, but not differences in taste for that product. People want different consumer goods, and people want to pursue different occupations. So I allow, in my thinking, for both. In the paper, draw on a famous mathematical paradox from the 18th century, the St. Petersburg paradox, to show that there would be logical inconsistency in claiming that that there were not differences in motivation. So I think Hirschi has written some response to his critics, to my mind, has largely ignored that. And so I think few criminologists would think that strain theories have nothing to tell us about crime, that it's all going to be an issue of differential control.
Now, how about your debate, the back and forth with, it wasn't directly with Donald Black, it was with one of his acolytes, Alan Horowitz, and then you've also critiqued Mark Cooney's work as well, work within that tradition.
Okay. So, Donald Black got a great deal of attention for what he calls a pure theory of law. And for him, that means only looking at macro outcomes and trying to remove from the theory anything having to do with individuals. I read his book with some interest and had several reactions to it. The most important one was that it wasn't a theory. It was simply a collection of empirical generalizations dressed up in somewhat abstract language. And there are generalizations like law can be upward, and the more upward the law, the less law there is, treating law as a quantitative variable, but without clearly addressing how one would measure the volume of law or the directionality of law. It seemed to me to be theorizing from someone who had very limited knowledge of the practicalities of research, how you operationalize a concept, how you measure it, how you assess its influence. Simply looking at zero-order correlations is a primitive way of studying relationships. There was no notion of taking into account control variables. In physics, which he knows about only through reading philosophy of physics and not from studying physics himself, he thinks that there is such a thing as like a pure science of the molecule that doesn't look at atoms, or the atoms that doesn't look at the nucleus. This is an oversimplification. There is cross-level influences that physicists sometimes take into account when relevant. So I wrote and published a critique. Donald chose not to respond directly, but to ask one of his former students, Alan Horowitz, to write a response. Now, I think Donald Black has continued to write volumes pursuing these further threads. I think he supplies a lot of testable propositions, making his work appealing to students looking for dissertation topics. I think that in the absence of mechanism, simply claiming a postulated relationship is a weak way of advancing our understanding. It leaves people with nowhere to go if a prediction fails. When his predictions or when his propositions are tested empirically, sometimes they hold up. That's worth noticing. It's not surprising, since the propositions themselves were empirical generalizations. When they fail, we don't know why that is. And so, to me, it's not a very good strategy for advancing our understanding of law. I don't think, apart from Marconi, that Black's strategy has become widely adopted. Although I learned a year ago at a conference that there is a book on the geography of genocide, which claims to be in the spirit of Donald Black. Some of the propositions that I learned about from the Author Meets Critics panel seemed trivial, such as the target of genocide is usually one that's politically weak. Others seem less clear to me, such as the claim that fear of the targeted group is often a motivating factor. In the case of the genocide of the European Jews, clearly if Aryan Germans were afraid of Jews, who were a small minority, it was the fear itself had to be understood sociologically. German Jews were not a realistic threat to Germany.
Now, I'm wondering if the fundamental crux of the debate here is over whether or not there is a social physics, if you will, that is even possible. So you trained as a physicist, and now you are a sociologist. I'm wondering if there's something that you see. Is there an intersection between the two, or is it?
Mostly not. Substantively, they deal with very different kinds of issues. Physics gave me some command over mathematics, but also a realization of its limitations for doing social research. And in physics, we don't ask what's in the mind of the atom when it moves one way or another. People do have minds. They have anticipated futures. They have goals. They have agendas. There are questions of how they cooperate. There are several circumstances in which physics is easy to do. One would be the two-body problem. When you have, let's say, two objects, gravitational attraction between two of them, if nothing else is involved, we can write down the equations for their interaction and solve them. Another circumstance where physics takes a simple form is when you have so many bodies that you don't care about the movements of any individual one, but you can do statistics by averaging over them. With people, we're often in the middle. The interactions involve more than two people. There are not so many that you can do large end statistics. And people have memories. Their past influence their futures. Their anticipated futures influence what they're going to do. The laws of physics, as far as we know, are uniform throughout the universe. Not true for cross-national spatial differences among peoples. So I don't see much in the way of substantive ideas or even methods being taken over by the social sciences. There's a legitimate independence of the social and human sciences in their own right.
And I notice in a lot of your work, you do trend, and you do, I suppose you do adopt the label of a critical criminologist.
I've never liked that term for several reasons. It's never clear to me what you're supposed to be critical of. Is it crime or criminal justice or criminal law or society or criminology? To start out with a notion of being critical seems to me an odd place to begin. When you're starting out an inquiry, maybe there's no grounds for criticism. Now, there's another meaning to the word criticism. When Kant wrote his Critique of Pure Reason, or Marx wrote Critique of Political Economy, he didn't necessarily mean that he was making negative comments. A critique can involve an assessment of the assumptions that are underlying a logic. That's how Kant used the term. What are the foundations on which you are building, and what are their limitations? Marx, when he was doing a critique of Adam Smith and Ricardo, was trying to understand what was the underlying logic and what its limitations were.
So you remarked that you're not beholden to any particular tradition.
That's right, and I would resist other labels also.
Right.
I draw on Marx, but I've drawn on Weber and Durkheim in some of my work. I've drawn on Freud in some of my work in gay studies, and on symbolic interactionism. I think we need to be open to all the conceptual tools that are available to us. Marx himself said, "I am not a Marxist." That was his answer when he was asked whether he would write like an encyclopedia of Marxist thought. And he said, there is no such thing as Marxism.
And so that really comes through, I think, in a lot of your empirical work, that you will test a proposition, and sometimes the evidence says that we can affirm this, and sometimes it says that maybe unemployment isn't the driver. Maybe it's business cycles.
It's important to respect evidence, and this is part of my heritage of physics. You know, physics has come up with a lot of imaginative ideas about the nature of physical reality. Most of them don't pan out. Now, the test is in the evidence. However, sometimes there's reasons for being suspicious of the evidence. I once had a conversation with Richard Feynman. He published a co-authored paper with Murray Gell-Mann in which they put forth what's called the V-A theory of weak interactions. And he did this in the face of 3 existing experiments that ran contrary to the theory. And so I asked him, it must have been courageous to do that. And he said, well, I have a pretty good sense about experiments. And those experiments were hard to do. I knew that that those results might be wrong, or at least that was a possibility. So we went ahead and published anyway. And the theory ultimately needed a little tweaking, but it proved to be an important one as a stepping stone toward that more sophisticated theory. And in the case of criminology, a lot of us work with imperfect data.
I'm wondering, this is kind of switching gears here in a bit of a way, I'm wondering if there's when you eventually pass away, everybody writes sort of a memorial, and I'm wondering what you want on that in terms of these are the landmark pieces that I produced that you would appreciate students reading in the future.
Some of the things we've talked about already, one we haven't discussed is my book, The Construction of Homosexuality. That book came about through the confluence of several different influences. I moved to New York to start teaching at NYU in the fall of 1973. The first course that I was asked to teach was an undergraduate course called Deviance and Social Control. I wanted for this course to choose readings that illustrated different research styles and would give students exposed to different perspectives, theoretical perspectives. So I chose for the week on homosexuality, I chose homosexuality as a topic because I could contrast social science research strategies with other ways of thinking about homosexuality. One of the readers was an article by Nancy Achilles. It was an ethnography of a gay male bar. And I had a guest speaker come to speak in the class who was a psychoanalyst. He talked about how pathological homosexuality was always associated with severe other forms of psychopathy, and talked in class about one man who castrated himself in the shower as a way of dealing with his homosexuality. I can remember a woman student in the class raising her hand and saying, some women might prefer male partners but turn to women because of male chauvinism, which they found unacceptable. And he said, oh, that's preposterous. There's plenty of non-chauvinistic men, and so this is clearly a rationalization for something else more fundamental. Well, he made exactly the points that I wanted to make. He got booed by all the women students in the class, but the ethnography of the gay bar was not concerned with diagnosing psychopathology. It was concerned with interactional practices that could be observed in the bar. Now, further influences that led to my working in that area had to do with my living in Greenwich Village. Greenwich Village has all kinds of people in it. Gay life was quite conspicuous. You'd see men walking hand in hand or with their arms around one another, dressed from head to toe in leather. The handkerchief code was in effect, so people had different color handkerchiefs from their back pockets, signifying something about themselves and their special interest. Seemingly, this was mostly accepted as simply part of living in a colorful neighborhood, but there was also episodes of anti-gay violence. On one occasion, an ex-Marine came to a gay bar close to my apartment with a semi-automatic weapon, opened fire, several men died, others were seriously injured. So this set me...
Was Stonewall?
This was not the Stonewall Inn.
Okay.
It was
were you there
different.
doing it?
No, I was living in Pittsburgh at the time. That was 1969 that the Stonewall Inn episode took place. But this started me thinking, what literature might there be in sociology that would help us understand this hostility toward people who are not bothering anyone else? There was literature on racial prejudice, anti-Semitism, anti-Chinese prejudice. I could find very little on what we now call homophobia. I don't think the word even existed at that time. I started doing some reading in psychoanalysis and I found some themes there. But in the back of my mind, I had the idea that ancient Greece was more accepting than modern societies. So I spent several years reading quite widely about Greece and Rome, other non-Western societies, anthropology, and so forth. I enlisted a graduate student, Marcia Bistrin, to work with me on this. I thought she knew more about psychoanalysis than I did. And we ultimately published 2 papers on this. I then had the thought that I could bring the papers together, puff them up a little bit, and have a cheap paperback edition. But I found as more and more I delved into this, there were rich historical materials that had not been explored by other writers. So ultimately, it took me 10 years to complete a book that's over 600 pages called The Construction of Homosexuality. When that book was finished, I thought I've said everything I have to say about that topic. but I later have returned to it on several occasions. I was asked to present a paper at a small conference in Portugal, all expenses paid, on a topic that was assigned to me, which was the pleasures of homosexuality. I didn't want to turn down the invitation, but because I thought they would disinvite me and I wouldn't get to go to Portugal, but I was not sure what I would have to say about this. I realized, though, that some Latin poetry I was reading at the time would provide some good material that could be incorporated into this article, and I wrote a paper that appeared in the volume of conference proceedings. Later, I returned further to gay issues in connection with debates that have been stimulated by evolutionary psychology. Evolutionary psychology tries to understand current social practices and mentalities as the products of natural selection. Now, homosexuality is a problem for an evolutionary perspective because it would seem to reduce reproduction rather than to promote it. So the field has now a dozen well thought out imaginative strategies for getting around this obstacle, and some of them have argued that man-boy sexuality in particular might foster reproductive success for a group. The older man can be a mentor or a guide to younger boys, for example. Many of these arguments seem to be not very well substantiated, so I've written critically about some of them. And I've done that now, again, from one thing goes to another, some work on sex registries and their non-impact on sexual crime rates.
Now, again, in sort of the continuing on the reflective kind of mode here, is there anything that you would have thought to do differently in retrospect in terms of your career progression, decision?
I might have turned down some invitations. I tend to, if someone asked me to write something for an encyclopedia, I might say no. I've discovered over time encyclopedia articles don't get drawn on. If researchers are going to draw on the literature review, they don't go to encyclopedias, they do their own literature review. The lay public doesn't really care about them. So probably none of the encyclopedia entries that I've ever written have ever been cited. There are short-term rewards. I know in my own department, pay raises are based in part on having a publication in the last year. But being more selective would, if I were giving my own younger self advice, it would be something I would follow. But being in sociology for me has always had the appeal that you can turn your attention to anything that grabs your interest. At some point in the past, I started studying ancient languages of the Near East. After the homosexuality book came out, one historian criticized me for relying on translations. Well, given the large number of languages of different countries in the world, it was inevitable, but he said, historians work with original texts. So I started studying initially Sumerian, then Akkadian, Hittite, Old Persian, lured by a high school classmate of mine, a mathematician who at the time was going for a second PhD in linguistics. My first Sumerian teacher was a towering figure in the field, did some brilliant work, and got me interested in early civilizations. So I invested the work. I learned to read cuneiform, became interested in trial by ordeal. For Weber, this is an irrational means of deciding cases, which went into disuse as society became rationalized. I started collecting cuneiform tablets describing trial proceedings. Many of them used ordeals of different kinds, oath-taking as way of deciding cases, the Divine River ordeal by which someone was thrown into the river to see if they sank or swim. Ultimately, I could see a logic to this. If you think that the gods are going to strike you down for lying, there could be a rationale for this. I've never had time to go back and more systematically to study the desistance project here. But, you know, as a tenured professor, you can afford to indulge these odd interests.
Speaking of sort of oddities in a bit of way, is from the outside looking in, falling in, we've already rejected the application of the term, but falling in was sort of a Marxist-oriented kind of working group, right? But at the same time being quantitatively oriented. Are there issues there in terms of acceptance in that audience?
The use of data?
Not particularly.
No.
No. You know, as I said as I told you a little while ago, Marx is one resource that I draw on where relevant, and for much of the work that I do, Marx does not provide insights into life course trajectories and in crime particularly. So I draw on whatever tools are available, and for much of my work, current work, it's more quantitative work. The one style of work that I don't do is ethnographic or qualitative interviewing. I once tried a project of interviewing kids that were on probation in New York. I quickly realized that I was not a good interviewer. I was not successful in drawing out the students, so I just decided I have enough on my plate already doing other things. I'll leave this kind of style of work to those who are better able to do it. But I do get drawn on sometimes by critical criminology journals to be a reader or evaluator of manuscripts, or to be called upon to do an assessment. I've been asked to write a review essay on Franklin Zimmering's work on the Great Crime Decline, and the invitation said, you know, you were one of the few people who have the technical equipment to assess the statistical.
Yeah, it's interesting because you can be sort of a liaison in a lot of ways between both realms, and do you see opportunity to kind of bring those two together in a bit of a way, or are they just destined to be self-separating or divided? Or
probably people that are attracted to Marxist work are not those that are strongly leaning in the quantitative direction, but there are some. Ray Michalowski has published quantitative work, for example, and the work that I did on growth of state prison populations was stimulated by a paper that he and a student published in the mid-1980s. They got data on prison populations and crime rates for 2 decade years, census years, and when I read it, I said, well, I know how to do panel data analysis better than doing separate cross-sections for each year, so that stimulated me to work with Valerie West and going.
You were kind of self-deprecating in terms of your ability to reach out to students or do interviews, but your CV lists more than a dozen, 20 some odd students that you've mentored over the course of the years. And what advice would you give to those who are in the business on how to successfully mentor?
People have very different goals when they come through our PhD program. They have different sets of talents, different kinds of jobs appeal to them. Some do not want an academic career, they want to do research. So it's hard to generalize. Certainly the recommendations for those who want academic careers are publications get you jobs, they get you good jobs. If someone is not interested in an academic career, that may be less important. I've never wanted to acquire disciples, and I don't think the effort would work very well because our students are too smart to be a disciple of someone else. What I encourage them is to develop their own ideas, but to try to think through the breadth of applications. Often students are initially captured by a small question, and so I ask them to think, is this phenomenon that you want to study an instance of something that's more broad? Because if you can tie this into something broader, then your potential audience is greatly expanded. part of the interest in the homosexuality study was this is an instance of deviance definition and redefinition over large periods of time. That's a broader theme that could interest people in alcohol studies, drug studies, mental illness studies, many different categories of deviance. So I hoped that my book would serve as a paradigm that would in some ways show that you could look at large-scale transformations of society as instigators, but moving beyond what is sometimes called conflict criminology. Conflict criminology sees crime categories as the products of social conflict, and the agenda is often either a ruling class or an elite stratum wanting to keep down a lower stratum or exploit it. This didn't seem to me to make much sense in relation to homosexuality, which occurs in all levels of society. Repressing it doesn't seem to confer any particular advantages for exploitation or so forth. I wanted to see whether there were ways of explaining that beyond the exploitation repression model. And I think that I gleaned some insights into that process, but I would look to other kinds of deviance categories to see whether that might apply. And one example, I'm now pursuing this line of inquiry in relation to a request that I was made a couple of years ago for a sociology conference. There was a panel on the topic, what do we need to know about human sexuality? You could write about anything you want. So my first thought was how to get more. But I thought I didn't want to write an advice column, and I decided as a theoretical exercise I would ask, what insights can Marxism give us to understanding the normative regulation of human sexuality? I suspected there were some, based on my work for the book, and some knowledge I knew about the rise of the literature on masturbation phobia in the 18th century England, where we see in the middle of the century a transformation in the language being used from a religious one to one that borrows on metaphors from the market economy. Boys are discouraged from wasting their capital unproductively is the new language that was being deployed. So I'm now trying to think through ways by which non-instrumental Marxism can lead us to understand the de-deviantization of homosexuality, the ends of bans to interracial sex, and so.
So thinking about sort of how laws are created and sort of the political aspects and the political implications and the political context in which this field operates, you've had some things to say about policy and speaking to policy, and I'm wondering if you could share with us just a bit about where you stand on these kinds of matters.
Okay. Well, I have great ambivalence in relation to that subject. When we were working on the book Struggle for Justice, the idea was to have a final chapter with policy recommendations. Caleb Foote, a very wise man, said we should have one paragraph saying, whatever you think will improve the system, don't do it, because chances are that it will make matters worse. The others on the committee, myself included, were horrified by this, and we did have a chapter on policy recommendations, but Caleb was right. We did make matters worse. Not that many years ago, I was at an ASC meeting when law professor Zalman, I'm blocking on his last name at the moment, came up to me and said, you, David Greenberg, are personally responsible for mass incarceration. Now, of course, that was ridiculous, and I certainly didn't have that kind of time, but we recommended short, fixed-length, determinate sentencing, abolition of parole. Now, Frank Zimmering later pointed out to me, if you write a draft piece of legislation that calls for a fixed sentence of 1 year, it takes only the tip of an eraser at the end of a pencil to erase that 1 year and replace it by 5 years or 10 or life without parole. So whatever influence we had as part of the critique of discretionary parole and discretionary sentencing in the court proved to be counterproductive. So it's made me very leery the people who make the criminologists who make the policy recommendations are not going to be in charge of the implementation. There are public pressures that often take an irrational stance on this. I was earlier this fall at a meeting, a panel discussion at NYU Law School on pretrial decision making. The presenters talked about the use of prediction instruments. I'm already skeptical of these, but at the end of the session, a middle-aged black couple, husband and wife, got up and said to the panelists, "Your prediction instruments are killing us." In the spring, in New Jersey, where they live, someone had been arrested and charged with possession of a handgun. He was released on recognizance. 3 days later, he went up to their son, pulled out a gun, put a bullet through his head, killing them. She said, crime is soaring now that they're in New Jersey, now that they're using these prediction instruments and more generous release before trial. In fact, crime is not soaring. Homicides had actually dropped in the year following the introduction of these measures. But public pressures catered to by politicians who will exploit these fears of crime will make it very hard for the criminologist to have useful insights. We have to do it. It's our responsibility to speak to the public and tell them what we know, but also being cognizant of the limits to our knowledge.
But some of your work actually emphasizes how little impact, in many ways, some of these policies have had too. The increases in policing and adjustments and has some limited impact.
And criminologists should point that out. And I was at a panel yesterday where James Austin made the point that others have also made, Al Blumstein among them. New York has sustained major drops in the numbers of people going to prison. It continues to have crime rates that drop. I did some research on arrests in New York City. They may have had some marginal impact on crime rates, but not nearly the large impact that the police department takes credit for providing. I presented on Wednesday, a paper on police stops in Los Angeles. My collaborator, Lily Khajavi, and I have data on all of the stops made by the Los Angeles Police Department in the year 2008, 880-some thousand stops. We are looking particularly at consensual searches. These are searches that take place after the reason for the stop has been concluded. Maybe a ticket has been written to a motorist or maybe not. Normally the officer would go on his way, but sometimes the officer will say, by the way, just for the sake of completeness, you wouldn't mind our searching your car, would you? If the person says, yes, this is a consensual search. My collaborator and I were interested in finding out how often these requests are made, who gets asked, what do they find when the search takes place, and on whom do they find it. It's not surprising that a disproportionate number of the people stopped were young black and Latino males, but since we don't know who is at risk of being stopped, that we don't make very much of that. We're interested in the post-stop outcomes. And we find lots of people are asked to submit to a consensual search, half of all pedestrians, maybe 1 out of 7 motorists. Black and Latino young males are very disproportionately asked. Everyone who's asked says yes. It's the one place where race and ethnicity are largely irrelevant. The great majority of the time they find nothing. Weapons are found in about a fraction of 1% of the time. Drugs maybe 2% of the time. On whom do they find them? Predominantly women, disproportionately middle-aged and older people rather than young people, and on whites more than blacks and Latinos. The police say, of course we're searching certain groups of people because they're the ones who are committing the crimes. Their own data show otherwise. So there is some value in this kind of finding. It may feed into a lawsuit on equal protection grounds, and the article spent some time looking at the different ways that challenges could be framed in court to these searches. given the low success rate, it would be hard to argue that these searches make an important contribution to public safety. But if they did, they're searching.
I'm wondering if, as you survey the field, you've been coming to ASCs for quite some time now, are there burning questions or things that we need to address, blind spots?
Well, we can see certain areas that are severely underrepresented on the paper topics. Corporate crime is an obvious one of them. In one of the plenary sessions devoted to the 50th anniversary of the President's Crime Commission report, I mentioned in the question and answer period that how striking it is that there was no task force on white-collar crime. I had been told privately by one of the members of that task force that did exist that there had been initial plans to have one, but that James Vorenberg, who was the White House representative supervising the work of the commission, that the White House thought it was too sensitive politically. The answer that the speaker gave was, in 1965, when the commission was appointed, white-collar crime, corporate crime was not very visible. Little was known about it. It was not seen as an important dimension of the crime picture. Certainly it is now. Hard to get data on, and we don't have the kinds of survey data or arrest data in numbers. What you tend to get is case studies. Mostly when I look at the program, I think there are too many papers. It's hard for me to believe that there are 1,000 papers that all have something important to say. I worry about the fragmentation of the field. We have special interest groups, sections forming. Initially, it was the Division on Women in Crime, where you could make an argument that women criminologists may have special career problems that need addressing. There was the International Criminology Division. Maybe because American criminology tends to be quite ethnocentric, there would be a special home for foreign criminologists. But now it seems as if every theoretical tendency wants a section of their own, every topic, policing, life course, and on and on and on. I worry that people are not seeing a broad picture and asking big questions. Some of this, I suspect, is due to the growth of criminal justice programs. If you are based in a sociology department, you are exposed to broad trends in social theory. Possibly the people in the criminal justice department will learn more about parole and probation. My own knowledge of some of the technical details of these fields is limited. They're topics I would take up for one lecture in a course, but I couldn't imagine giving a course on parole, for example. In the criminal justice program, many of the students are planning careers in criminal justice, and so there would be a reason to offer more coursework in those. But I wonder, are people connecting to broad trends in theory? Probably at the best schools, the answer would be yes, and I think of Maryland, Albany, Irvine, Arizona State, Cincinnati. In the other departments, I'm not so sure.
Any advice to folks who want to achieve success, future generations who are viewing this, trying to anticipate what are the tools of the trade or tricks of the trade, the things that they need to think about doing well?
You have to keep learning. You're not done with school with learning about stuff. You have to keep learning about new discoveries, new ideas, new methods. Next semester I'm going to be teaching a course that I created decades ago but haven't taught in 15 years called Advanced Statistical Methods. So in the interim, there have been new developments. Bayesian statistics has been growing. I've known about Bayesian statistics, thinking about how to teach it, what software I use, new examples to keep the material fresh in the minds of the students. I would stress to younger generations to be self-critical. We always are easy to persuade ourselves that our own ideas are great. We have to step back and really ask hard questions. We have to seek out critical perspectives from perhaps by circulating our ideas to people who would be predisposed to disagree with them, and then find ways to meet that challenge. My classmate in graduate school, David Friedman, told me his father said, "You should know your opponent's arguments better than they do." That's a strategy for winning arguments, but we also have to know the weak spots in our own work and try to take them into account as best we can, and be open about acknowledging the weaknesses. Now, this is a point where I would have had some disagreement with Travis Hirschi. He said you should be a lawyer for your ideas and give the most vigorous defense of your ideas that any lawyer could give to a client, even if this is one-sided. To me, this is contrary to the spirit of truth-seeking, which I think should infuse all of our scientific work. And that also means acknowledging results that may be politically unappealing to us. There is an understandable tendency to, we should worry about our work being seized upon, misrepresented, and used to justify policies that we would not want to see. But we can't hold back the truth for that reason. We do have to be careful about package it.
I suppose in summation here, I've sort of exhausted the list of sort of to-do. Is there anything that I failed to ask, or topics that you think are important to have on the record that I've missed?
I would encourage people, when they have personal experience, to be able to draw on it effectively. I'll give you a kind of amusing example from my early childhood. I grew up in Chicago in a neighborhood close to Wrigley Field, kind of white, lower middle class neighborhood. For the most part, crime was not an issue in the neighborhood on a daily basis. Only once was major crime brought to my attention as a child. There was a serial killer working in the neighborhood for a period of time. So parents cautioned their children, don't take candy from strangers, don't accompany a stranger who wants you to go with them. The police are your friend. But at the age of 8, a couple of my buddies broke into a house. Now, Chicago had been hit by a hurricane at that point in time, and a good deal of damage was done to the yard of one residential setting. I should say predominantly lower class neighborhood, but there were some big mansions, fenced off, elaborate gardens, and the elderly resident of one of those big houses was out of town at the time of the hurricane, and when the damage was done, knocking down a big tree, this seemed like an attractive place to play. We had had some interaction, my pals and I, with the elderly woman who lived there. We knew she was away. I forget now how we knew this. So we thought it would be adventurous to break into the house and explore it. So we did. I didn't take anything. I think they may have taken some small trinkets. Someone must have seen us, because a few days later, or a week later, when I was in my 3rd grade class, a messenger came up from the principal's office that the police were in the principal's office, wanted to question me. So I had to go down. My parents had been summoned, and they had identified us, and we had to go to the police station with them, and they showed us the lockup. So this was a scared straight strategy, and it worked. The thought of being incarcerated in that cell did make me very cautious. Now, part of the general knowledge of my pals and I were that you had to be a certain age before they could send you to a reformatory. We never knew anyone who got sent to a reformatory, so where this knowledge came from and whether it was even accurate, I couldn't say. But when other people were skeptical about the reality of deterrence, I had reflected on that experience, and I knew that some people are deterred by threats, and that had to be taken seriously as a possibility. Now, the other way I drew on personal experience had to do with my political involvement. You know, at various times as an activist, I ran afoul of the law, or witnessed episodes where law enforcement was engaged in dubious behavior, and I'll mention some of those examples. I spent some time in 1966 working in a voter registration campaign in rural South Carolina. This was 2 years after the Civil Rights Act. We were in a small town talking to people, black citizens, encouraging them to register to vote. We stopped off in a coffee shop and had lunch there. While we were having lunch, we could see some people going in and out of the restaurant. We didn't think much of it, but when we left, we could see maybe a block away there was a small mob carrying rifles or shotguns. So we ran for the car. As we were running, we passed a police station. And so I asked one of the black kids who was with us, should we go into the police station? I said, no, they're with the mob that's chasing us. So we ran to the car, got away. They did shoot us as we were driving away. No, their aim, fortunately, wasn't very good. Later on, in the draft resistance movement, I was arrested in a connection with a sit-in. The police, as they lifted us to put us in the paddy wagon, smashed our heads against the upper back door, so we were all bloodied and bruised going into the station. When we went before a trial date was set, and we were charged with disorderly and resisting arrest. We had been disorderly, so that charge wasn't manufactured. None of us had resisted arrest. Our lawyer disappeared, came back saying, the judge will give you a $25 fine if you plead guilty to both charges, a month in the Cook County Jail if you plead not guilty. Now, I had never heard of plea bargaining at that time. I thought the lawyer may have bribed the judge. That wasn't the case. But they insisted on guilty pleas to both charges because then they could say that we were injured resisting arrest, and this would give them an out if we raised a stink about police brutality. Now, I saw other instances of police or judicial misconduct when I was in Pittsburgh. I was part of a picket line that was picketing a construction site. We were protesting the white-only hiring policy of the construction company. Workers on the building started throwing pieces of metal down at us, so we ran across the street to escape the barrage of metal. The police standing by arrested us for jaywalking or disorderly, not the people who were throwing ingots at us. When we were brought into court, every time a white defendant came up to the front, the judge, before we could say anything, said, I can see that you must have been swept up by mistake, dismissed. They were not dismissing the charges against blacks. Seeing what was going on, we whites lay down on the floor in front of the judge and refused to move. They just picked us up and carried us out. There was another episode that was even more shocking. There was a small candlelight vigil in front of the home of a draft board member, and the police were standing by. The draft board member came out of his house, went up to the 16-year-old girl who was leading the picket line, punched her in the face, knocking her to the ground. The police closed in and arrested not the assaulter, but the picketers, who were all acting within their lawful rights of picketing on the sidewalk. So the picketers were brought into court. The judge walked into the courtroom and then walked out. The doors closed, the lights went off. Police came into the room with black knuckles and started punching out our people who were there, either as witnesses or as demonstrators. A melee erupted. It ended up with 4 of our group being hospitalized and 4 police officers being hospitalized. So all of these episodes, I guess I'll mention some further episodes. In Chicago, when I was active in the draft resistance movement, our phones were tapped. On one occasion, police arrived at the communal apartment that we had with a warrant to search for marijuana. The officers came in. They went directly to an ashtray where there was one stub of a marijuana cigarette. we had strict rules against having any drugs to prevent vulnerability for a drug raid. Because they knew exactly where it was, we were quite certain it had been planted there. So all the residents of the department were charged with possession. Now, fortunately, when an officer gets a warrant, they have to establish under oath a basis for the warrant. And the basis for the oath was an officer testifying that he had bought marijuana from one of the residents of the apartment on a certain day, and that was the basis for searching the apartment. Now, fortunately, that person from whom they claimed to have bought marijuana was in jail for a demonstration. So the warrant got knocked out, and the police claimed they had other witnesses to drug dealing. We asked them to produce those witnesses. They gave us a name but did not produce the witness. And we subpoenaed all the people in the Chicago phone book with that name. They said it wasn't them. So clearly the police were lying to get the warrant. I saw them lying in Pittsburgh also. There was a free public park concert given by Joan Baez, and one of our group was passing out leaflets, was arrested on charges of an officer who said he had elbowed him with his elbow. Well, this person, like me, was short. The officer was very tall. There's no way he could have reached him with his elbow. Ultimately, in some way, that charge got knocked out. Anyway, I did not have a naive faith in the honesty or the integrity of the functionalist accounts of law enforcement, that this is simply to preserve public order and protect life and property. There was the police could be acting as agents of repression. I also felt that's not the only thing they did, so I didn't buy into a simple notion that the police are only an instrument of repression, but it is one of the things that I think police do. And I think that perspective has informed some of the empirical work that I've done on law enforcement.
Well, I want to thank you for sharing with us, our community, posterity, an awful lot of what you've done over the course of your career.
Thank you.
All right.